and they were the Tlingit people of Kake village. And they came back on August 11th, 2014, and visited Coopville. And I happened to be the volunteer at the time who was sitting at the front desk and took the call. So I'll tell you more about that as we go on. And then Michelle Cladusbid is going to talk about what she learned about the visit of the Kake people here in 2014 from her elders in the Tlingit. She's an adopted Tlingit, and she is also our board president of the Historical Society. So I'm taking my data from secondhand sources, and Michelle will give you some things that she actually heard from the elders of Kake about how everything went down and how everything happened that day. And so we want to know who exactly were the Northern Indians. And these are the main tribes: the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Haida, the Bella, the Kwakwakwa, and the Nushalnuth, and the Bella. And the Kwakwakwa, you know, I've been trying to get that off my tongue for years. Every so often it comes out right, and today it didn't. But anyway, these are the groups that they talk about. They, in one way or another, especially the Tlingit and the Haida, and I guess the Bella were folks that raided down in our area. And when they came, they were plundering, basically, and they were also kidnapping people and taking them home as slaves. All of the cultures of Northwest Coast were slaving cultures, which was, as was the U.S. at the time of this historical. This is where the Tlingit lived. They lived really at the top, just below the Canadian border, the Tlingit, and you can see as it goes down. And then once you get down here, it's the coastal Salish people that we live with. And totally different cultures, but very similar at the same time. When you think about the North Coast Indians, you think of the huge wooden, beautiful plank houses with the great, wonderful totems. The totems are, from my understanding, they're heraldic. In other words, the descent of the family in that house traces its ancestors through those, the figures on the totem pole. Plus, they were great artists. They carved wood implements beautifully. They were a seagoing canoe culture, and they were a warrior culture. The man in the middle is supposedly Tlingit. And they also were into the fur trade. They got a lot of wealth from that, exchanging with Hudson Bay's company and other companies up there. They also made beautiful chilkat blankets. And these are woven of mountain goat fur hair. And they're noted for those blankets. You can see figure here. This is a weaving thing. And they were salmon people, of course. That was their big staple.
Michael, I'm going to pause you for a sec. Sure. If you guys don't mind scooting over, we have 3. Do you have one more seat next to you? And we have 3 seats in the front. If you guys want to sit, feel free to move on up. And we also have 1 seat right here. And I am happy to pull some more chairs out if you'd like some in the back. Okay. These 3 are open if you guys want to move up.
Yeah, there's 3 seats up here right on the front row.
Yeah.
Northwest Coast folks were also, they would find copper ingots on the ground, just laying around. They didn't have to mine them or whatever, but they would find pieces of copper around, and they would work the metal, and they would work them into these art pieces that had a value, sort of like, in some sense, like money. They would hammer out the ingots and design them, and then they would become very, very valuable pieces of art, and they would use them in bartering. And I read one account where one of these coppers was worth all of the contents of one of the major houses. I mean, they gave it a name of something like empty the house copper. In other words, if you had that copper, you could buy the whole house. This is what, in terms of traditional clothing, the cedar bark and the rabbit fur were what the native people dressed in, as well as the local Salish folks. And then after the settlers came, the blankets and other forms of clothing, they adopted white clothing also. I think maybe it was warmer. And they were warrior cultures, and this is what made them feared so much in the Northwest, in our area. They had armor, they had helmets. You can see the carved helmet on the head, and there's an area to peek out. They were armed with knives they were armed with these sword-like knives that were just very fierce. And when they went to war, it was a sight, and it must have been an incredible sight. And the Tlingit especially, were in Russian America at the time, or the Russians were in Tlingit America at the time, however you want to look at that. And they fought the Russians tooth and nail. They did not want the Russians there. And it's listed as one of the third big reasons why the Russians left Alaska. The war with the Tlingit was so ongoing, it was taking all of the profits from their fur trade, and they were being wiped out. And the Battle of Sitka, that's a graphic of that. They really beat the Russian Navy and Army. I mean, they just obliterated them. And you can see these graphics, and Russian America is sort of like on the other side of the pink line and gets down into the Tlingit area. This is Fort Sitka, which was the head of the area where the Russians were headquartered.
I can share an oral history on that too.
Oh, good, good. Now this is something I had to put in this time. I didn't have it before, but the settlers here were terrified of the Northern Indians, as were the local Salish. And the Salish kind of allied with the settlers here for mutual self-defense against the Northern Indians. But the people who lived here, they were, as you can see, they respected and feared the Northern Indians. They had very low opinion, as the quote was that I read, of the Northern Indians. They thought that the Northern Indians delighted in war, rape, and murder. And I saw that, and then after my experience with meeting the Tlingit, it made me realize some of the settlers have forgotten about the Monroe Doctrine, the Manifest Destiny, rather, doctrine, which basically said the people of the East, the whites in the East, that everything between here and the Pacific is ours, and it had Native people had no right to any ownership or whatever. And there was a recent incident in Oregon, low southern Oregon, where a native village was literally just destroyed. I mean, they pulled a cannon up to it over a hill and they blasted the people. Total massacre of a group of people. So when I heard that people here were looking and making judgments about the local people, the natives from the north. It just didn't seem like they were remembering what their own history was. And so I put this. The graphic in the middle is a very famous painting that represents the whole concept of manifest destiny, of America moving west. And you can see on the left there where the native people are being pushed out. And then the other two graphics are of the Pequot village in Connecticut. The Pequot were a major confederacy in New England, and they went to war with the settlers, and they literally were wiped out, and they sold all of the survivors to slavery in the Indies, West Indies. So again, it's just, having met the Tlingit here, it's given me a perspective of both sides that I didn't have growing up. And this is who was Colonel Ebey. We all kind of know who he is, but he was lawyer and customs collector, first non-native settler, first to stake out the donation land claim over where the Ferri house is. Came out from Missouri, encouraged his family and his wife's family to join them. He was a farmer. He grew wheat, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, largely and other grains, so he was very successful in that way. He was a very important personage in the community. He was a possible candidate for territorial governor, so he could have become governor of Washington State. He was a strong proponent of manifest destiny. And he raised and outfitted a company of volunteers to fight in the Yakima War, but they never saw action. I have to tell you a little bit about the Yakima War because that plays into what happened during the whole incident. Many of the tribes on the other side of the mountain and on this side of the mountain all the tribes are being urged to cede their land to the government. And the Chief Leshai of the Nisqually and Kamayakan of the Yakima, on different sides of the mountain, refused and went to war. And very early on in the war, Chief Leshai was captured and convicted and hung, and they determined that it was an illegal action. He should have been treated as a prisoner of war, but he wasn't. And Kamayakan, however, continued the war with the Yakimas on the other side of the mountains. And the tall figure here is Kamayakan. There don't seem to be any photographs of Leshai. But that's a drawing from the time. And that's Governor Stevens. He was the one that was tasked by the government to go around and have all of the treaties signed and have the land ceded. And he was under a lot of pressure to do that because the settlers who were coming more and more in this area were very upset and wanted more land. So he had a lot of political pressure, a lot of public pressure. And so he didn't really do the reservation system very well. I mean, he put groups together that probably should have had their own reservation and so forth. And finally, the Yakimas and the folks over on the other side of the mountain attacked Seattle. And it was, you can see that's Seattle from the old days. Very sparse in buildings, but when the clarion call went out and they said the native people were attacking, they all ran to a particular blockhouse there. And that war went on for 3 years. And just a little incident to this, Granville Haller, whose house is being restored here in Cookville, he saw action in the Yakima War. So that is actually a painting of his unit fighting over in the west of the mountain, east of the mountain. Little connection. the Yakima War was centered in the eastern part of the state. The coastal people weren't that affected, but panic was spreading all the way through Whidbey Island and our coastal area. The reports of northern Indians raiding in Whatcom, Steelicum, Nisqually, Port Gamble, and Port Townsend contributed to the panic on the coastal areas. And the northern Indians were raiding, and they would plunder the potato crops, and they robbed Salish homes as well as settler dwellings. And what was happening is the people over here in our area were so afraid that the local and the northern tribes would ally with the Yakima. And if that were the case, there would be big trouble in our area as well. And so panic was just stalking the whole area. And that was sort of like the setting of what happened to Colonel Ebey. This panic, people were on edge. Even though there was no telegraph or anything like that, they had ways of keeping in touch. People would come over in a boat from Port Townsend to tell people if you hear what was going on the other side. So they kept pretty well informed. So finally, a flotilla of Tlingit canoes came down from Kake, and they came into the area near Port Townsend. And reports of the attacks near Nisqually, 2 men and a child were killed. There were all these incidents that were filtering back to the population. They were hearing about it, and everybody was on edge. And the citizens demanded protection. And they wrote letters to the editor over in, we're still doing that, we're still writing letters to the editor. They wrote letters to the editor over at the paper in Port Townsend. And they demanded that the government send help to deal with the problem as they saw it. And I just thought these were, I mean, this is sort of an image of what would have happened to see a flotilla of canoes to come down over to Port Gamble, right over on the other side. And this is what you would be facing. I mean, a very, I think, very ferocious looking opponent. And, you know, the drama of their presence was enough to instill fear. So the Navy sent out a sloop, a schooner rather, the USS Massachusetts. And I love this guy's name, Captain Swartout, S-W-A-R-T-T-O-U-T. I can't imagine how people would say that quickly either. He was sent out, and they located the encampment of the northern Indians over in Port Gamble. It was right across a little inlet there. And Port Gamble, of course, was a mill town at the time. And this guy got in some big trouble later on from embezzling some money, but that's another story. And so they said to the encampment, as you all have to leave. And of course they refused. The Tlingit were the top dogs in the Pacific Northwest coast. They were used to being, having everyone fear them. They were imperious is the word used by some folks. In other words, that's the way it had been for millennium. They were the top dogs. And all of a sudden, here comes these Americans and saying, no, you can't camp there. You got to get out of here. No, we're not going to do it. So, unfortunately for the Tlingit, they had a howitzer and some other smaller cannon, and they charged us. So you had people with muskets, hatchets, sword-like wooden implements, clubs, spears and bow and arrows, and some muskets too, fighting against a howitzer. Well, they blew the camp apart. They were right in the woods, As soon as the firing started, everybody ran to the woods to hide and get behind trees. But what happened is the howitzer would blow up a tree. I mean, just splinter it. And many of the people killed that day were killed by wooden splinters that came from those trees. I mean, it was a horrific kind of one-sided battle. And of course, Lincoln had to surrender. They had no choice. All of their canoes were destroyed, and the blankets were burned and or confiscated, which will figure in how they got home later. So supposedly this was a message to the northern Indians that you need to stop coming down in our area, taking slaves and marauding and stealing. And so they thought this was going to be a good lesson to teach the northern Indians, but it didn't. They were not impressed, and they continued sending raiding parties, undertaking vengeance attacks. A lot of these attacks on where people were killed weren't just what we would consider murder, but they were vengeance attacks, where that person or somebody in that person's village or town may have killed a member of their tribe or their people. And that was the way of justice was to eye for an eye. If you kill somebody, you usually had to make a reparation in blankets and goods. But if it was a high chief, a high-ass Ta'i, the way they called it, you had to pay with another life. It wasn't just bought off with blankets. So, so they came down and they were causing lots of trouble. And again, fear in the area just rose. And what happened is, I've run out of graphics by now. There are no graphics showing Colonel Ebey's death. Nobody was there with a photograph or even I couldn't even find an image. So anyway, the northern Indians went back up north to the Tlingit, to the village of Kake, and they decided they needed to take vengeance for the death of their chief. A chief was killed there at the battle. His legs were both broken from splinters from the woods, and he died. And 26 other people died too that day. One sailor was killed, and there's a local historian over in Gig Harbor that says he may have been killed by friendly fire, so it's not quite clear. But anyway, they went back. We have to send a raiding party back south to take our vengeance and for the death of our chief. A woman in his clan volunteered to lead a party. So she and this small party in one small boat came down 1,000 miles in that boat from all the way from Kake Village, which is 95 miles south of Juneau. They came down and they landed on Whidbey Island at Ebey's Landing. Oops. So, like I said, I thought I had another image, but they went to the door late at night. The dog was barking, and Colonel Ebey went out and asked them what they wanted, and before he could even go any further, they shot him at least 4 times from all the records I can find. So then they took his head. That was the way of war of the northern Indians, and even the Salish people here. There are stories about Chief Snakelam when he was attacked by some of the northern Indians. They took heads as a trophy and a proof. So they took his head and they got in their boat and went right back up north. Of course, the word spread right away. Panic was just everywhere. People were freaked out, and they rounded up about 18 northern Indians over in Kitsap Peninsula. And these Indians were not the ones that actually were in the party that killed Colonel Ebey, obviously. But they rounded them up just the same and threatened to kill them unless the Tlingit warriors came in and turned in the ones that were that actually killed Colonel Ebey. They let some of them go. They put these prisoners in a makeshift jail, and then most of them got in. And then 4 days later, all the remaining ones dug out from under the jail and got escaped. So I mean, it wasn't very secure. So we have. So basically, there was never anybody that was caught who actually did the raiding. And that is basically the story up to the death of Colonel Ebey. And then along comes 150 some years later, I was at the front desk at the museum volunteering, and I get a call. I'm calling from the organized village of Kake in Alaska. You probably haven't heard of me. We're the Kake people. And I said, oh yes we have. Everybody in Coopville knows you. Of course I was exaggerating, but I mean the museum community did. So they said, we want to come and visit Coopville. We want to bring some of the elders, and we want to go to the site where Colonel Ebey was killed and so forth. So we were just, I mean, everybody was just, couldn't believe it, after how many years that we're finally going to meet the Kake and see what, hear their side of the story. So Jim and I had them over for dinner along with a lot of local people from the museum. They didn't want a public event. They just wanted to keep it quiet. They had been over on the other side of the Kitsap Peninsula doing a visitation to the Sklallam, because the Sklallam had lost a lot of people over the years to the northern Indians. So they didn't really talk about what they talked about with the Sklallam, but it was sort of a elder to elder kind of trip, and maybe they were making some amends from on a tribal level. But anyway, we all waiting for them. Dinner was ready, and the ferries were late. So I got a call, and then finally they showed up. Not everybody was able to make it. They couldn't get everybody on the ferry or something. Something went wrong, so only about 5 or 6 of them. So I went to the door when they knocked, and I opened the door. Everybody's like, here they are, here. And the first person I see is Ruth Demmert, and she says to me, "We come in peace." And we all just laughed. I mean, it was such a wonderful way of breaking the ice and so forth. So those are the ones over there. Let's see. I think yeah. The elders were the 3 folks in the middle, obviously, and then on the other end is Phelan Mills. She was one of their chaperones. And the woman on this end is Dawn Jackson. She was operating and planning and director of the organized village of Kake. Her father was, and her family were in the administration of the Kake village. So they had gotten, I guess, a grant from the government to come on this trip with some elders. And if you'll notice, that's the ferry house. And the Ebey cabins were behind the ferry house. They're no longer there. And you can see the plowed field. That's where Ebey's cabin was, as far as people are able to tell. And so we gave them a tour the next day. They wanted to see that. And so we had a chance to listen and to talk. And there were people here, there were people from Jim's Sherman family, Alvin and Roger. And Then Hyde from the Haller House was there and people from the museum. And we had a very interesting exchange. It really was eye-opening for us and for them to hear how we saw things. These are some more. Finally, we felt like we made some friends that day, and that the rift between our two communities was healed after all these years. It was very, everybody felt good about that. After the group left, I got an email from Dawn, and this was something that I quoted it. I was caught off guard in high emotion while on Ebey's Prairie when it finally sunk in that we lost 27 people at Port Gamble, and then to hear what the Ebey family had to endure in the middle of the night. I had to walk the prairie and beach to sweat it out and retrace everything, wondering about all of the pain of everyone. What a gruesome time, what a time, what a time. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of our visit with them. And now I want to give you over to Michelle. She can tell you her connection and where she got the information that she's going to share. Michelle Cladusbid, she is the president of the board of the museum here in Cookeville.
Hi. Hey, I'm actually really surprised at the number of people, so I just want to ask a quick question. What were you hoping to learn today? Like, what drew you here? Anybody can just...
My wife's family is from Early, here on the island. And her grandfather was a history professor at Ellensburg and came over at the turn of the century for about 30 years. And we have letters in the 20s from Chief Shelton about this event, and many other events on the island. And I was curious about some of the details that Chief Shelton had provided. Like, for instance, I was when I asked, the time of the Navy coming in and doing what they did, to the time when Ebey was involved, was like 9 years, is what it said in the letter. Is that possible?
1 year. Actually, they had the battle over in Port Campbell, and then a year later,
Is when they
Tlingit came in.
But I was curious to hear details of what you could provide of what we had heard from different chiefs that he had recorded letters from.
Well, if you want to share those letters with the museum, we can make copies.
There's
That would
quite a
be wonderful.
substantial amount of information in that Professor Fish was his name, was provided by the chiefs, and they were writing a book. And then the professor died of a heart attack, and it never was continued. All that documentation the family has donated to Ellensburg, because that's where he was the head of the history department.
Right. Well, that's good to know.
So
that
it's a
somewhere
place
on
if you want to
record.
go look it up.
Yeah, great, thank you.
That's great. That's great.
I want to know why the group of people were what provoked them to come down. I mean, I understand they wanted to make amends with the Scotland people, but what was their
Are you
interest
talking
in
about
coming here?
2014?
Yeah. What provoked that?
You would actually have better
Well,
information about that.
Dawn told me that she had come here years ago personally and had just sort of walked around. She didn't say anything about to anybody locally at all. And that she wanted to come back and bring some of the elders to the spot where the Colonel Ebey was killed. And they still had, which Michelle can tell you more about, the oral history of that. For many years, they blamed the Haida, which are just south of where the Shimshin live. And they were blamed for the troubles and the death of Ebey, and even there's a marker out at the beach that, lists them. And so they wanted to bring the elders who still had the memory in the tribal history. The sense was that they were still connected to the ancestors when they got here. I mean, that was the feeling I had. That it was like going to a spot where a huge section of your family had been killed. I mean, they went. I assume they went over there and then coming here. So it was a personal thing, and the three elders, you know, were their tribal elders carrying that oral history and passing it down to the next generation. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm losing my voice. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I got you. And
Yeah, I'm curious as to why Colonel Ebey.
Oh.
Was there?
I'll answer that for you.
Yeah.
I will. So, if anybody doesn't have anything else to add, Michelle Cladusbid, I am not native. I am adopted Tlingit. My Tlingit name is Adanake, and that name Adanake means keeper of the knowledge and speaker of the truth. So when I was adopted into the Tlingit tribe in Alaska, I am a Wishkitan, which is a shark. My moiety is eagle, so I'm an eagle shark, Wishkitan, out of Hoona, Alaska. My family is the Jackson family. So that's how we, when we're in the tribe, that's how we identify, which is a little bit different than how they do things down here. When I met Tony, I asked him what his moiety was. He looked at me like I was nuts. And I said, well, how do you know who your family is? And he's like, I'm a Cladusbid. But, you know, when I meet people down here, I was really fortunate to be adopted. I was asked in 2008 if I wanted to be adopted, and I said no. I didn't feel as a white woman that I had earned that, right? Well, little did I know that I had insulted the elder who wanted to adopt me. Because in the white way, you know, we assume we know better. And I'm going to speak that way. So I might offend some, but I'm going to speak that way. And her husband, who they both spoke Tlingit fluently, they were both fluent Tlingit speakers and teachers and elders and storytellers. And they took me under their wing, even though I insulted her. My sister is Carolyn. And he pulled me aside and he said to me, if she asks you again, say yes. Because she would not have asked you if she didn't think you were worthy. And so that was my first education in Tlingit culture about how do Native communities work and how do we fit in, right? So I will say I am not Native. I don't claim any Native heritage. I don't have any Native blood, but I was trained by elders, including Ruth Demmert. My previous husband was Tlingit. I was adopted before I met him, but Ruth is his auntie. And the Kakes who are also here are his relatives as well. So I was very fortunate, and what I learned from Tlingit culture and Tlingit history is that things are passed down orally. And I will take oral history over a written, somebody else's version ethnography any day, okay? When we talk about stories like Ebey, I'll share that one with you, but I wanted, Michael had mentioned Sitka. So I just want to share this because this is, again, an oral history that's super important. In 2008 was my first time on canoe journey in Alaska, and it was very significant because I was like one of two white people on that canoe journey, and I was invited because at the time I was the board president for the United Way of Southeast Alaska. We had donated some money, and nobody else on the board wanted to go. And I was like, yeah, I'll camp out for 5 days. Like, I'll be on a canoe. I want to learn. You know, I want to learn about the people in the community in which I live, which was Juneau. But we traveled from Hoona, and in that year, 2008, we also installed a totem pole, and it was an eagle shark pole. If you were here at Water Festival, Doug Chilton actually carved that pole. And he is a Daishitan, which is our business. Tony and I have the Beaver Tails Coffee and the Schwadops Cultural Center. Deshitan is actually beaver, and that was, Doug is one of the reasons that we have that. My previous husband and a brother of theirs, they are all Deshitan. They used to tell stories around the fire. And again, that oral history, right? Telling stories and sharing the history, bringing the youth in and sharing those histories. So that's how we share. That's how we communicate and pass that history down. It's also how we train our youngsters so that they learn. It's like the moral stories, right? You learn these stories through your history and why we do the things we do, or how come we have a ceremony the way we have a ceremony. And so we're sitting around the fire one evening, and a man by the name of John Duncan, who was a Kiksati, so that's a frog, out of Sitka, started telling this story. And he said, when we land in Juneau, he pointed at 5 of us. He said, you, and you are my wives. I said, well, I'm married. I don't know what my husband's going to think about that. And he went on to tell the story of his great-grandfather, Katlayan, who was the chief who drove the Russians out of Sitka with a literal hammer. And what they did was they attacked the Russians, drove them out of Sitka, then the Russians came back, bombarded them, and drove them over the mountains. So that whole group got driven over the mountains out of Sitka. They're back, right? But so those are the stories, right? And no doubt about it, Tlinkits are warriors, for sure. But I also want to share a little bit about, Tony talks about, what's the word? What is it that we always do? You say it one way, I say it another way. Semantics. Mm-hmm. So, semantics are different. It's like when we talk about slavery in the Native communities was not the chattel slavery practiced in the U.S. Slaves often became members of the families. They could, and at least in Coast Salish culture, they could rise to whatever level in the tribe. They weren't treated as less than. There are stories that we have been told, and that I have been told, about slaves in Alaska who were sacrificed at the 4 corners of the longhouses. Those were not sacrifices. When they tell those stories, those weren't sacrifices where people went up there screaming and kicking and, oh my God, don't kill me. Those were people who were slaves who willingly stood at the corner post because it was an honor. And that's how, so I really want to challenge people to think differently. Like, think about the semantics of the words that are being used. Because what we know as slavery is very different. And yes, the Tlinkits were absolutely a warring community. They not only traveled just down here, they traveled to South America on canoes. And there's evidence of that. They're very close to the Dene people, the Navajo people, and they have traveled inland down that way. Our languages are similar. The Athabascan people, who are even farther north than the Tlingit in Alaska, have traveled all the way south. And we have these stories. We have Tlingit relatives who are Swinomish. Like, I know people at Swinomish on the reservation who are relatives or cousins. And I call them my cousins even though I'm not Native, because we're related. I can trace them back in their lineage back to people that I was trained by and know by. So that happened in 2008, and I was first told stories, and I met Ruth, and I met some other really important elders who have now passed. And I was fortunate that they took me under their wing, allowed me to make mistakes, and man, I said some really dumb stuff. I'm not going to kid you. Out of ignorance and out of naivety and not understanding. But I wasn't excluded. I was corrected, I was taught, and I was embraced. And so that all makes a difference. So when I came home, I was raised in this area. I was raised in Washington. I grew up in the Seattle area and out by Snoqualmie and Issaquah and Bellevue and Kirkland and all those areas there. But my cousins lived on Whidbey. And so we were in Whidbey a lot when I was growing up. And I spent a lot of time in the islands. But one thing that I did not experience as a child growing up in Washington was Native culture. And I didn't experience it because we're segregated. Natives are on reservations, and they were much more when I was growing up. I just turned 60, so I was born in 66. And, you know, we didn't see Native people. Like, everybody in my town was white, you know. So I didn't have any experience with other people or with different history. I was raised with the white history. We were all raised with a white history and a white view of that history, even the semantics of it. So when we talk about the Kake Tlingit, again, I was so fortunate because people like Ruth, we literally sat around fires and told stories. And the children and the young people sit down and we are quiet and we listen. My brother-in-law, John Martin, who is now passed, he is what they call a landless Tlingit. So his group didn't have a village and their land was taken from them. And so his village does not exist anymore. And so his village was in Teneke. And, how did it end up being Ebey? Well, let me tell you. So they came down for their raid, and often it's about resources, right? So they're raiding for resources. They do take people because, you know, natives are pretty smart, and that's how the clan system got started, so there wasn't inbreeding, right? You got to bring new blood in. So, yeah, you're going to go and you're going to take people that are not your family, and you're going to bring them home, right? So you'll find a lot of natives in the Coast Salish communities who are related because there was intermarriage. And part of that really was about keeping the peace. Because Tony says this all the time, you're not going to go to war against your family, right? So there was a lot of that. There's a lot of conceptions. I'm not going to say misconceptions. I'm just going to say conceptions about and semantics about what are these things that happened. So they came down to raid. They were in Port Sklallen, Port Gamble. They were told to leave. They didn't leave. 27 people were killed, including the chief. The Tlingits went home. We don't call it revenge. And if they really wanted revenge, they would have come and wiped out or killed an equal number of people. They didn't. They came to get someone of equal stature to the chief that they lost. So think about that. They could have come and wiped out everybody in retribution, but their justice doesn't do that. Their justice is about power for power, not just eye for eye, because if it was eye for eye, there would have been 27 dead settlers, right? It's about power, and it's about authority. So the woman, it was a woman from Kake who led that, a woman warrior, came down, and they originally went after, who was the doctor?
Kellogg.
Yeah, so they came for the doctor because at the time he was the most powerful person in the area, but he was unavailable. Lucky for him, right?
Yeah, he was.
And so
offering the
when
stick.
they asked who's the next person, Ebey was identified. They came, they got their retribution, and they went home. So, you know, when you talk about the oral histories, it's like I look at it differently because I'm hearing it from the people who actually were there. And, or, you know, historically, right? Like the Kake people, I'm hearing it from the generations of that story told. And there's morals in that story, right? There's things in that story. It's not just like we went down and killed this person. There's stories about building relationships, right? There's stories about the morality of it. There's stories about not wanton waste. They came, they did what they needed to do to balance everything, because in Tlingit culture, it's all about balance. You have eagle, you have raven. Those are two moieties. Everything is about balance. When we have a kuik, which is a memorial party or a naming party, we balance it. You have ravens and you have eagles, and those are what the clans are. So my clan is an eagle clan. Wishkitan is under the eagles. We are balanced, and so anytime an eagle does a song, a raven does a song, right? Everything is about balance and harmony. It's about place and land. So when Ebey was killed, it wasn't about coming and taking over, it was about rebalancing everything. And isn't that a different perspective?
Well, I'm thinking of all these letters I've read. They're really old, but still, that perspective, because that's all coming from particular chiefs that he was recording oral histories from. But it makes me think, gotta go back and find them all.
Yeah, it would be great. I'd love to see those, right? I'd love to see those. Because, Tony shares stories all the time from his people as well. And there's different perspectives. But what you're going to get in the base of it is always about balance. It's always about place. It's always about who's here. And so, yes, I can totally see why when the Kake came down, think about that. I think I had that reaction the first time I ever went to Boston, to think about how my relatives had been walking those places, right? Like that I was walking in a place that my ancestors had walked. And so if you think about that from the Native perspective in the time immemorial, it should help you understand why land and place are so important, because the Native people have been here for thousands of years. This land is built upon the bones of their relatives. So when you talk about feeling the ancestors, absolutely. You can feel the ancestors. When Tony and I first walked out onto the wharf, we could feel our ancestors. And I say ours, but you can feel it. We just participated in the Camas camp out at PRI this last 4 days. I cried on multiple occasions. It was overwhelming to see not only the education and the history and the culture and the protocol, but the connection to the land, the reciprocity that goes into maintaining and stewarding the land for the future generations, and teaching those young people how to care for, how to interact with, how to do the things that will sustain the land and then essentially the people for generations to come. It's overwhelming, especially from someone like me who doesn't come from that background. I didn't have that connection. The first time I ever had that connection like that was in Alaska. The first time I stepped onto the soil in Alaska, I felt like I was home. And because there's no reservations up there, well, Metlakatla is a reservation, that's Tsimshian, but it's like the only reservation in Alaska. People are mixed in. Like, it's totally a different community feeling, right? Because you are next to a lot of brown people. Like, half this room would be Native, because it's about 50% of the population. Like in Juneau, it's about 50-50. Might be 30 Native, whatever, 70, but it's pretty close. And there's open reverence for the land. So even like in Alaska, Juneau is called Occoquan. It's the Quan is the land, so Occoquan, it's the land of the Occ people. And that's how they acknowledge that land every day. It's not about, this is Juneau, we're white. It's about, you're conquered or whatever. They still refer to it as the land of the original people. The Taku Kwan, the Huna Kwan, the Angoon Kwan, the Kake Kwan. So like Angoon is the fortress of the brown bear. Huna is known as the people of the north wind. So we came from the the north wind, the glaciers. I think, I'm trying to remember because I don't always remember everything clearly, but like there's the people from underneath the glacier, right? I think that's Yakutat. And so you hear these origin stories, you hear the stories that tie these people for thousands and thousands of years in these locations. So yeah, you can feel the ancestors. If you listen and you absorb, you will feel the previous people that were here.
I wonder if I could ask a question. In the letters that I had seen from her grandfather with Chief Snakelam, which is this particular bay, he made it real clear in the letters that I'd read that there was a royal blood link to the tribes and villages here. And he described 9 villages within this area. But each one progressively is more, depending what direction you go, more or less royal blood. So the tribe that is where Chief Snakelam's at, the one over here on this side, that's the royalest of all of these in this code. And as you go progressively, they got all the way to the slave area, right? How does that link in, or do you have any comment about that? Because I didn't understand that they had
I would
royal
think
blood.
Tony would actually have a better comment about that.
You go ahead.
No?
No, I'm comfortable right
He's observing. Well, I don't know about the royal blood part, I know that there were 9 family homes, and I also know that by the time the settlers were coming, that the natives of this area already knew what was going to happen. And that's why the treaties that were made here were treaties in peace, because they weren't wartime treaties. They weren't in war. They willingly gave the land in order to preserve their culture. So a little bit different.
Now, could you just tell us a little bit more about when the settlers came, the people here already knew what was going to happen?
Well, so people. This is about semantics again, right? Did you have something, Delva?
No, we're coming to the end of our
Okay.
time, so.
Okay. The native peoples, if you look across the whole United States, right, all of our highways were native trails, right? So there were forms of communication that existed long before there were telegraphs and Wells Fargo and all of that. And the natives were able to share the information. So they knew, the natives here knew what was coming. They already knew about the Trail of Tears. They already knew about the Long Walk. They already knew about the genocide and the starvation and the diseases. They already knew about the land theft. So they were just trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we manage, these people are coming, the new people are coming, and there's not a darn thing we can do about it. So how do we survive in that? And they also had, so people, if you read our founding documents, those merciless Indian savages who actually developed agriculture and helped all of our new people survive, right? They had medicine, they had architecture, they had engineering, they had, communications and governance, which we borrowed, right, or stole, and not well, but you know what I mean? And so all of those things, this wasn't an empty land of people who didn't know anything. These were people who had lived here for thousands and thousands of years on this land and stewarded the land, the whole north to south, right? This whole continent. So of course we knew. right? Of course they knew what was coming because they already had communication. They have ways of communication. One of the most important hikes I ever did, in Alaska, I used to hike 3 or 4 days a week, because there was way more trails than there was roads. And one of the most significant hikes I did was the Chilkoot Trail, which was the Gold Rush Trail, which was actually an Indian trading trail that was commandeered for the gold rush. But hiking that trail, walking on those lands, seeing not only the gold rush equipment that was left, but also seeing the indigenous pieces, because they do a really good job of talking about that, was really just enlightening. And again, you can't help but feel that reverence of going to sleep in a place where people have lived forever, right? And cultivated and created and survived. So yeah, that's how they knew. Yeah, they knew.
So I'm gonna put the questions down here for a minute, because Michael has just a few more things to say, and our time is limited, so we're gonna hand it back over to Michael for a few minutes. And then if you want to talk to either of the speakers once we're finished, while the rest of us are cleaning up, feel free to grab them then for a little bit of one-on-one time, okay?
Thank you, Michelle. Just a few more slides. This is the village of Kake today. And there's Elder Ruth Dimmert over there in the corner. This is Mike Jackson. He was the, I guess, chief, I think they would use the word chief, of the organized village of Kake. It was his daughter that brought and organized the trip down here. And they lived on Kuprianov Island. This woman came along on the trip too. She was one of the chaperones in her regalia. That's a totem that welcomes you at the beginning of the village. Just to give you a sense of what their life is like today, the community life, very rich community life. And this is something special that we have, only we have, and now the Kake have it too. There was a woman who lived here in Coopville. Her name was Mary Young. She lived down on Front Street. Her parents lived at Kake in the 1930s, and they helped to run the cannery that they had, the salmon cannery. And these are family pictures that Mary gave us that we shared with the Kake. And that's, it just give you a sense of the old village and the change in life. The boats are so much different than the ancestors had, so forth. And these are some of the people from Kake that they knew. In the 30s, this is a wonderful family treasure. These are portraits from an artist by the name of W. Langdon Kin. I saw these portraits in the 1950s when I was a child. And I was just taken by the beauty and the grandeur of these folks. And I happened to run across them on the web. And so I just wanted to share them with you. They're just incredible. He went around Alaska and painted the portraits. In the 50s, it was cowboy and Indian movies, it was really, they'd have, everybody looked like a Plains Indians in the movie, it was just not authentic. And here he captured the real essence of the dignity of the people. And those are some of the Tlingit that, who knows, had ancestors that encountered Colonel Ebey, and that's the end of our story. Thank you for coming, I appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is just an amazing turnout, and I hope that you all learned something new that you did not know before today. This is just the third in our series of special talks that we're having this year. We're taking a break from the monthly talks because starting the first week of June, which is coming up very soon, are our porch stories that are every Wednesday at 2 p.m. on the museum porch. And we have a full schedule for you, so I hope that you'll come to some of those. Everything is available on our website, so if you want to look up and see who's talking about what. And we'll be kicking them off on June the 5th with Coast Salish stories. So I hope to see you all then, and thank you again all so much for coming, and thank you Michael and Michelle for an amazing talk.